after World War II. It was actually offered to countries within the Soviet bloc, but they turned the aid down. It turns out that if we look at, and Tyler Cowen has a great article about this, in which he dismisses the importance of the Marshall Plan by pointing out that the Marshall Plan never exceeded 5% of GDP in any recipient country. During the time when the Marshall Plan was being administered to Germany, the occupation costs and the reparation costs that the United States was imposing on Germany were 11 to 15% of GDP. And this was West Germany. The country that got the most Marshall Plan aid, what do you think it was? It wasn't West Germany. It wasn't France. It was the UK. It was Britain. Which had the worst performing economy in the post-World War II period? Britain. And in fact, they mentioned Mansur Olson. The West German miracle begins not with the Marshall Plan. The West German miracle and the explosive growth of West Germany after World War II and its recovery from World War II begins when Ludwig Erhard, the finance minister, on a Sunday, what had happened was that Hitler had imposed wage and price controls on the economy because he had partially financed the war by printing money, and there was going to be inflation. So the Allies maintained those wage and price controls when they occupied West Germany. And Erhard, on a Sunday, issued a decree eliminating all of those wage and price controls. By the way, in this post-war period, the German economy, 50% of the German economy had reverted to barter. People would work 3 or 4 days in a factory, get paid in pots and pans, go out into the countryside, and trade them for food. And Erhard eliminated the wage and price controls. He took the meat axe approach, just eliminated them entirely. And the reason he did it on a Sunday is because he didn't want the Allied occupation authorities to countermand the order. So what happens is, the next day, Monday, General Lucius Clay, who's in charge of the occupation, calls Erhard into his office and says, all my economic advisors tell me you made a huge mistake. And Erhard replies, all my economic advisors tell me the same thing. Don't pay any attention to that. And within days, the shops start filling up with items for sale. And that's the beginning of the West German miracle. Now, that, of course, doesn't necessarily explain sustained economic growth after that, but Mansur Olson has made the following interesting argument, that, as countries go along, more and more special interests involved in rent-seeking create more and more restrictions on economic activity, get more subsidies, get more privileges, and so you have this incrustation of economic regulations that tend to inhibit economic growth. And the reason these countries recover so quickly is because the war cleans the slate, eliminates all of those special interests, their privileged positions, and so you get to start, right? You get a fresh start for the economy. So that's his explanation. In other words, even this strongest case in favor of foreign aid, after close examination, is not as strong as it seems to be. All right, what am I going going to do next? Oh yeah, what else am I going to say about the borders, the impact of borders? I mean, that's obvious. There's an interesting discussion about trade and economic growth. Does trade have a level effect, or does it have a growth effect? I think everyone agrees that, or let's put it this way, does trade only have a level effect, increased trade, or does it also have a growth effect? And if you turn to page 670, Solow gets asked this very question. And I think he gets the answer right. It's the second question that he gets asked, and it's at the end of that question. He says, I can easily, well, the question is, so the important factor for growth is the degree of openness of an economy, question mark. I can easily imagine a country breaking out from being an undeveloped, stagnant economy and getting on the growth train as a result of trade. That I can easily see, but whether a country that is already growing at the same sort of rate as the OECD economies can improve its growth rate over a period of many decades by virtue of openness or trade, that seems to me to be unproved. And I think that's a fairly sensible analysis. Let's see, I guess I don't really have much to say directly about the rest of Mankiw. The rest of Snowden. What I'll do is sort of try to give you sort of a simplified way of thinking about endogenous growth theory, and then move on to institutions. All right. You have three. You can think of endogenous growth theory and the augmented Solow model as add-ons to the Solow model. In other words, the Solow model can't explain what it's supposed to explain. So what can we add to the Solow model so that we get sustained growth? And essentially, there are three categories. The augmented Solow model, or what Snowden and Bain call the MRW model, Mankiw, Romer, Wheel, where you introduce human capital as another factor, and the way Solow presents it in his second chapter on growth is the most straightforward. So he replaces the labor input, right, with a labor input, which he calls the efficiency of labor. And essentially, this is his exogenous technological innovation that is making labor more productive. And then you have the AK models. And then you have the two sector models. And you have all kinds of variations on these, but I've already described the difference between the AK models and the two. These two fall into the category of exogenous growth theory. So since this is not a course on growth, I just want you to be familiar with these different categories. They all have the impact of introducing diminishing returns, introducing constant returns or increasing returns to scale through the back door. Now, I do want to say one thing about introducing technology into the production function, there are actually three ways you can introduce technology into the production function. You can do what Mankiw does in his augmented model, where essentially what he's doing is introducing technology as labor augmenting. The only difference is that he uses E rather than A. You can have technology augmenting capital, which is what the AK models do. Or you could come up with a model where technology affects total factor productivity. And these have names that you don't need to remember. All right? If you introduce technology into the production function this way, it's called Herod neutral. If you introduce technology into the production function this way, it's called Solow neutral. And if you introduce technology into the production function this way, it's called Hicks neutral. For the Cobb-Douglas production function, it doesn't matter what you do. It comes out the same. But if you ever go on to more complex production functions, then it could make a difference. Another way, let's see how another way of comparing these different. Remember, we're still in the proximate causes of growth. Another way of comparing these different growth models. I've essentially given you 5. All right? We have Herod-Domar, our Keynesian growth model, Solow-Swan, our neoclassical growth model. We have the augmented Solow model. And then, augmented slope. And then we have our 2 types of endogenous growth theory, AK, and 2-sector, or you could also refer to it as a technology sector. And then I've also introduced Austrian theory. So I want to compare these along 3 issues. Issue number 1. Do they have diminishing returns to capital? All right. Herod-Domar? No. Solow-Swan? Yes. Augmented Solow? Yes. AK, it depends on what you mean by diminishing returns to capital. In other words, it's accepting diminishing returns to capital and then saying capital automatically creates technological innovation. So is that really diminishing returns to capital, or, so it's a little bit, that's how you want to interpret it. This definitely has diminishing returns to capital, and Austrian theory does not have diminishing returns to capital. Is technology exogenous? That's criterion number 2. Yes. 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 No. No. And with Austrian theory, again, you could depending on how you interpret technology being exogenous, because Austrian theory isn't actually written out in a mathematical form. You know, in other words, it's saying that technology is always available, and the capital is the binding constraint. And then finally, does the model move to a steady state? No. Yes. Here, you have the steady state is not a steady state. It's called the balanced growth path. So that's how you want to interpret that. No. No. Showcase and dangers of excessive technical. So I think that sort of gives you a schematic way of thinking about these different models.
A general question about steady state.
Yeah.
No country's ever reached it, right? That we can.
Well, you can think of poor countries that are stagnating as having reached the steady state. I think this probably, even though you have a balanced growth path, you're still having an increase in output per person, and therefore I would say that's probably. Now, the one empirical fact that the Solow model is halfway consistent with is convergence. What we observe in the real world is, as Snowden and Bain pointed out, is conditional convergence. The tendency of poor countries to catch up with rich countries sometimes, once they've crossed this threshold into sustained economic growth. And we can even quantify it. Usually the catch-up is at 2% a year, which means it takes a long time to catch up. The best examples of convergence that we have are actually within countries, regions within countries. So one example is, yes?
Or is it 2% growth rate?
No, the catch-up. In other words, the gap between the two countries in terms of their output closes at 2%. So I guess that would imply that the country catching up has a growth rate that's 2% higher than the country that it's catching up with.
So approximately it takes 35 years for the 7 years. Does that apply? Or is that divided by?
Yeah, but you see, no, you can't say that because you don't know how much higher the other country is, right? So one of the classic examples is within the regions of the United States. On a per capita basis, counting slaves as people, what's interesting is that in the U.S. prior to the Civil War, when slaves were treated as livestock, per capita income between the North and South, if you looked at the free population, had converged. All right? The U.S. began enjoying sustained economic growth in the 1830s. And that applied to all regions if you looked at the free population. In other words, average income per capita in the North was about the same as average income per capita in the South. On the other hand, if you counted the slaves as people, I added them in, then the average income in the slave states was about a quarter below the average income in the free states. And then with the hit from the Civil War, the example I've talked about with the withdrawal of leisure, it fell to about 1/3. So after the Civil War, the South, on a per capita basis, was 1/3. Output per capita, income per capita was 1/3 lower than in the North. So you had this slow process of convergence where after the Civil War, the North is experiencing sustained economic growth. The South is experiencing sustained economic growth at 2% faster rate. So when does the South finally catch up with the North? In the post-World War II period. Now notice, this takes place within a country where there are no political obstacles to trade or immigration. Another case is northern and southern Italy. In other words, the whole convergence issue points us to the fundamental causes, right? Because we observe convergence where you have mobility of capital and mobility of labor and relatively free trade. That's where we observe convergence between countries, and where you don't have that, we tend not to observe convergence. So that means we need to start talking about these fundamental factors. One of the authors who's frequently cited in Snowden and Bain, one of the, this is, as I've emphasized a couple times, where all of the most cutting-edge research is being done is in economic history, and one of the authors who's involved in this is Acemoglu, and The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, Why Nations Fail is a recent book that he wrote on this issue. And he's focusing on institutions. And he gives an example that's not quite as stark as the North Korea and South Korea example, but probably more relevant in the sense that the differences between the two economies are not quite as sharply distinct. He starts this at the beginning of his book. The city of Nogales is cut in half by a fence. It would be cut in half by a wall with trumpets this way. If you stand by it and look north, you'll see Nogales, Arizona, located in Santa Cruz County. The income of the average household there is about $30,000 a year. Most teenagers are in school, and the majority of adults are high school graduates. Despite all the arguments people make about how deficient the U.S. healthcare system is, the population is relatively healthy with a high life expectancy by global standards. The people of Nogales, Arizona can go about their daily activities without fear for life or safety and not constantly afraid of theft, expropriation, or other things that might jeopardize their investments in their businesses and houses. Life south of the fence, just a few feet away, is rather different. While the residents of Nogales, Sonora live in a relatively prosperous part of Mexico, the income of the average household there is about